The last sound in the sprawling mansion was the ticking of a clock, or rather, the clocks that never ticked anymore. Silence thick as fog wrapped the empty rooms like a burial shroud. An armchair sat in the dark corner of the great hall, facing a sealed window to a world outside that had no place for laughter. The man who owned all this, all the opulence overlooking San Francisco's glistening skyline, had lost something far more precious than money. He'd lost himself. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're glancing at an old photograph on your nightstand, or thinking about a time when life felt whole, when dreams weren't just echoes in empty rooms. It doesn't matter what time it is or where you are, but I promise you, today's story will touch your soul in ways you haven't felt in years. This is the story of Marcus Hendley, a tech billionaire whose empire crumbled like autumn leaves, only to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the smallest hands and the purest hearts. The morning light filtered through the mansion's towering windows, casting long shadows across marble floors that had once echoed with the sound of celebration. Now they reflected nothing but emptiness. Marcus sat motionless in his leather chair, staring at the San Francisco Bay, where fog rolled in like memories he couldn't escape. His fingers traced the rim of a cold coffee cup, untouched since dawn. The silence was deafening, more oppressive than any boardroom argument, more crushing than any hostile takeover he'd ever faced. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Cable cars climbed steep hills, their bells ringing through the morning air. Fisherman's Wharf awakened with the scent of sourdough bread and the calls of street vendors. But inside the mansion on Pacific Heights, time had stopped 6 months ago. It had stopped the moment Sarah's laugh had faded from these walls forever. Marcus Hendley once stood at the peak of Silicon Valley's elite, his name whispered with reverence in boardrooms from Palo Alto to Wall Street. His tech empire, built on revolutionary artificial intelligence software, had generated billions in revenue. His stock portfolio alone was worth more than some small nation's GDP. Bitcoin investments made during the currency's infancy had multiplied his wealth exponentially. Yet, all those digits in his bank accounts, all those assets and properties scattered across 3 continents, meant nothing now. The mahogany desk in his study was littered with unopened letters from investors, lawyers, and business partners. Legal documents demanding his attention lay scattered like fallen leaves. His company's stock had plummeted 40% in the past 3 months. Scandal had erupted when competitors accused him of corporate espionage, though the charges were baseless. Without his steady hand guiding the ship, his empire was listing dangerously. Board members called emergency meetings he didn't attend. His personal assistant had stopped trying to reach him weeks ago. The penthouse felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Antique clocks lined the hallways, Baroque masterpieces, Swiss timepieces, grandfather clocks that had cost more than most people's houses, but their hands had frozen the day Sarah died. Marcus couldn't bear their ticking, couldn't stand the reminder that time moved forward while his heart remained stuck in that terrible moment when the doctor's words had shattered his world. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hendley. We did everything we could." Her photograph still sat on the fireplace mantel, dust gathering on the silver frame. Sarah's smile seemed to mock him now, radiant, alive, full of dreams they would never share. She had been his anchor, the one person who saw beyond his wealth to the man underneath. Without her, success felt hollow, achievement meaningless. Every morning he woke hoping to hear her voice calling from the kitchen, the scent of her coffee brewing, the rustling of newspaper pages. Instead, he found only silence and the weight of memories too heavy to carry. One gray afternoon, as October drizzle traced melancholy paths down the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus stood in his study reviewing financial reports that blurred before his tired eyes. The numbers meant nothing anymore. Profit margins, quarterly projections, dividend yields, all of it felt like a foreign language he'd forgotten how to speak. He was contemplating selling everything, liquidating his assets, and disappearing somewhere Sarah's ghost couldn't follow when a desperate splash shattered the afternoon stillness. The sound came from the lake behind his estate, a small body of water surrounded by weeping willows and wild roses that Sarah had loved to tend. Marcus rushed to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. Through the mist, he saw something that made his heart skip, a small figure struggling in the dark water, arms flailing weakly against the current. Without thinking, without calculating risk or consequence, Marcus ran from the house for the first time in months. The October air bit through his thin shirt as he stumbled down the gravel path toward the lake. His expensive Italian leather shoes slipped on wet stones, but he didn't care. The child, for he could see now it was a child, was no longer thrashing. A terrible stillness had settled over the water. Marcus dove in without hesitation, the icy shock nearly stopping his heart. His searching hands found a small body, unconscious but breathing, and he pulled the child to shore with strength he didn't know he still possessed. She was no more than 9 years old, with tangled dark hair and skin pale as moonlight. Her pink jacket was soaked through, torn at the sleeves. But even unconscious, waterlogged and shivering, there was something extraordinary about her face, a serenity that seemed to radiate from within, as if she carried some secret the rest of the world had forgotten. As Marcus performed CPR, pressing rhythmically on her small chest, he whispered prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood. When her eyes fluttered open, Marcus felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking in the first warmth of spring. Her gaze was steady, unafraid, storm-gray eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. She didn't cry or call for her mother. Instead, she looked directly at Marcus and whispered in a voice barely audible above the wind. "You don't need to fix the world all at once, but sometimes saving one soul can change everything." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a child he'd just pulled from the brink of death, speaking with wisdom that seasoned philosophers would envy. He wrapped her in his coat, lifting her slight form easily. As they walked back toward the mansion, she introduced herself simply as Lena Rodriguez, and when he asked why she'd been in the lake, her answer was equally simple. "I was looking for something I lost," but her eyes suggested the thing she'd lost wasn't an object at all. But Marcus was a man who had built his fortune on logic, algorithms, and cold, hard data. Miracles were for fairy tales and greeting cards, not for billion-dollar boardrooms. As he set Lena down in his living room, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders, skepticism crept back into his voice like frost returning to a window. "Save one soul," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're just a child. You don't understand how complicated the world really is." Lena accepted the hot cocoa his housekeeper brought without thanking him or looking impressed by the mansion's opulence. The crystal chandeliers, the Persian rugs, the priceless artwork, none of it seemed to register. She simply sat cross-legged on his leather sofa, sipping cocoa and watching him with those unsettling gray eyes. When he pressed her about her family, about how she'd ended up in his lake, she answered with maddening simplicity. "My mama works 2 jobs," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of immigrant dreams and American struggles. "She cleans offices downtown and stocks shelves at night. We live in the Tenderloin." Marcus knew the neighborhood, rough streets where the city's forgotten struggled to survive another day. It was a world away from his Pacific Heights mansion, separated by more than just geography. "That doesn't explain what you were doing in my lake," Marcus insisted, his voice sharper than he intended. "Or why you were talking about souls and changing everything." The words felt awkward in his mouth, like a foreign language he'd forgotten how to speak. Lena smiled then, not the bright, innocent smile he expected from a child, but something deeper, sadder, infinitely patient. "Maybe that's the problem," she said quietly. "You've been trying to fix everything except yourself." Her words carried no accusation, no judgment, just a gentle observation that cut deeper than any hostile takeover bid or shareholder revolt. Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. This child, this stranger from the city's forgotten corners, had looked into his soul and seen what he'd been hiding even from himself. The anger rose in his throat, familiar and protective. "Go home," he said curtly, standing and walking to the window so he wouldn't have to meet those knowing eyes. "Your mother is probably worried sick." But even as he dismissed her, Marcus found himself watching from the window as Lena walked down his gravel driveway, her small figure disappearing into the fog. Something about her presence had changed the quality of silence in his house. It felt less oppressive, less final. For the first time in months, one of his antique clocks had begun to tick again, a soft, steady heartbeat that seemed to whisper that time hadn't stopped after all. Day by day, Lena returned, not because Marcus invited her, but because something in her spirit seemed drawn to his broken soul like light to darkness. He would find her by the lake, gathering fallen branches to build tiny boats that she'd launch with wishes whispered too softly for him to hear. Sometimes she hummed lullabies in Spanish, melodies that seemed older than time itself, inherited from grandmothers who had sung them in distant countries under different stars. Marcus began to watch her from his study window, telling himself he was simply concerned for her safety. But the truth was more complex. In her presence, the mansion felt different. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunbeams instead of settling like ash on unused furniture. The roses in Sarah's garden, neglected for months, began to show new growth. Even the fog rolling in from the bay seemed less oppressive, more like a gentle caress than a suffocating blanket. One afternoon, Marcus found courage he didn't know he still possessed and joined Lena by the lake. She was arranging smooth stones in careful patterns, creating mandalas that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. When he approached, she didn't look up, simply patted the ground beside her in invitation. "My wife used to love this garden," he heard himself saying, the words coming easier than they had in months. She said flowers were like prayers made visible. It was the first time he'd spoken Sarah's name aloud since the funeral. Lena nodded as if this made perfect sense. "She still loves it," the child said simply. "Love doesn't stop just because someone goes away." The statement should have sounded ridiculous coming from a 9-year-old. Instead, it settled into Marcus's chest like warm honey, easing an ache he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without pain. That night, for the first time since Sarah's death, he slept without nightmares. Over the following weeks, their conversations deepened like roots finding water. Lena spoke of her mother's exhaustion, of nights when Rosa worked until dawn and still couldn't pay all the bills. She talked about her school, where teachers struggled with too many students and too few resources, but she never complained, never asked for anything. Instead, she shared stories that somehow transformed hardship into hope, poverty into richness of spirit. "Sometimes," she said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and crimson, "when nothing makes sense anymore, faith wears the face of a child." The words seemed too profound for her young voice, but Marcus was learning not to question the wisdom that flowed from her like water from a hidden spring. For the first time in months, Marcus found himself talking about his regrets, not just Sarah's death, but the years before when work had consumed him like a fever. Board meetings that lasted past dinner time, business trips that stretched into weeks, phone calls that interrupted precious moments he could never reclaim. The guilt was a weight he'd carried alone, but somehow, speaking it aloud to this strange, wise child made it lighter. "I failed her," he whispered one afternoon as fog rolled in thick as cotton. "I was so busy building an empire that I forgot to build a life." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful as an open wound. Lena reached over and placed her small hand on his much larger one. Her touch was warm, grounding, real in a way that nothing had felt for months. "She knew you loved her," the child said with absolute certainty. "Love isn't counted in hours or money. It's counted in moments when hearts touch." Their growing bond didn't go unnoticed. Lena's mother, Rosa Rodriguez, was a woman worn thin by struggle but not yet broken by it. She worked nights cleaning office buildings in the financial district, then stocked shelves at a grocery store until dawn, catching buses that carried the city's invisible workforce through streets lined with tech company logos and luxury car dealerships. When she discovered that some rich man in Pacific Heights was spending time with her daughter, every maternal instinct screamed danger. Rosa confronted Marcus on a rainy Thursday evening, arriving at his mansion with fire in her dark eyes and exhaustion lining her face. She stood on his doorstep in her cleaning uniform, rain dripping from her ponytail, and demanded answers. "What do you want with my daughter?" she asked in accented English that carried the weight of 1,000 worries. Marcus invited her inside, offering coffee and explanations that sounded weak even to his own ears. How could he explain that his daughter was saving his life without sounding either crazy or predatory? Rosa's skepticism was palpable as she took in the mansion's opulence, the artwork worth more than she'd earned in a lifetime, the furniture that cost more than her annual rent. "Rich men don't help people like us without wanting something," Rosa said bluntly. "I've worked for enough of them to know." Her protectiveness was fierce, beautiful in its intensity. Marcus recognized the look. He'd seen it in Sarah's eyes when she defended causes she believed in, people she loved. Despite Rosa's suspicions, Lena continued her visits, drawn by something neither parent seemed able to understand or control. The child's presence had become essential to Marcus's healing, though he couldn't have explained why. With each afternoon spent by the lake, each quiet conversation in the garden Sarah had loved, Marcus felt pieces of himself reassembling like a puzzle, finding its missing pieces. The first real crisis came with winter's arrival. San Francisco's mild climate was deceptive. When fog turned to rain, and rain turned to sheets of cold that seeped into old buildings without proper heating, the city's poor felt winter's bite more keenly than snow-covered mountains ever could. The Tenderloin district, where Rosa and Lena shared a one-bedroom apartment, was particularly vulnerable. Old buildings with thin walls, landlords who ignored broken heaters, and utility bills that forced impossible choices between warmth and food. Marcus learned about their struggle not from Lena, who never complained, but from his driver, who mentioned seeing the child walking through downpour without proper rain gear. The knowledge hit Marcus like a physical blow. While he lived surrounded by temperature-controlled comfort, this remarkable child who had become his lifeline was cold, possibly sick, certainly suffering in ways her pride would never let her reveal. That evening, he drove to the Tenderloin for the first time in his adult life. The contrast was stark and shameful, 20 minutes from his mansion, but a different world entirely. The apartment building where Rosa and Lena lived was narrow, wedged between a check-cashing store and a corner market with bars on its windows. Paint peeled from the walls like old skin. The hallway smelled of cooking spices, human struggle, and dreams deferred but not abandoned. When Rosa answered his knock, her expression was guarded. Behind her, Marcus could see Lena lying on a thin mattress, her face flushed with fever. The apartment was barely larger than his walk-in closet, but it was clean. Organized with the careful efficiency of someone who understood the difference between poverty and squalor. "She's sick," Rosa said unnecessarily, as if his wealth might have blinded him to obvious suffering. "The flu is going around her school. Kids who can't afford to stay home when they're sick spread it to kids who can't afford to get better." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with purpose he'd forgotten existed. "Let me help," he said simply. "Please." The conflict erupted the next day when Marcus's business partner, David Chen, discovered that Marcus had been spending company resources on what David termed charity case distractions. The two men had built their empire together, emerging from Stanford's computer science program with dreams of changing the world through technology. But where Marcus had found love and attempted balance, David had found only ambition and the endless hunger for more. "You're having some kind of breakdown," David said bluntly, pacing Marcus's study like a caged predator. "This obsession with some random kid is destroying your focus. Our stock price is in free fall, the board is losing confidence, and you're playing fairy godmother to people who wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire." The words stung because they contained echoes of truth Marcus wasn't ready to face. His attention had been divided, his legendary focus scattered. But David's dismissal of Lena as some random kid ignited anger Marcus hadn't felt in months. "She's not random," he said quietly, dangerously. He paused, struggling to find words for something that couldn't be quantified or analyzed. "She's what?" David pressed. "Some kind of miracle worker? A child prophet? Listen to yourself, Marcus. You sound like someone who's lost his grip on reality." David's voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who had never experienced loss, never faced the abyss that swallows meaning and spits out empty success. The confrontation escalated when David threatened to call an emergency board meeting to remove Marcus as CEO. "I'll do whatever it takes to save this company," he declared, "even if it means saving it from you." The betrayal cut deep, not just the threat to his position, but the revelation that his oldest friend saw his healing as weakness, his connection to Lena as pathology rather than salvation. That same week, as if the universe were testing Marcus's resolve, Lena's condition worsened. What had seemed like simple flu developed into pneumonia, her small body struggling against infection that quality health care could have prevented weeks earlier. Rosa's insurance through her cleaning job was minimal, covering only basic emergency care. The kind of treatment Lena needed, specialists, tests, medications, required money Rosa simply didn't have. Marcus found himself in the children's ward of UCSF Medical Center, a place where hope and heartbreak walked hand in hand down sterile corridors. Lena lay in a bed that dwarfed her small frame, oxygen tubes making her look even more fragile than she was. But her eyes, when they flickered open, still held that strange serenity that had first captured Marcus's attention. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping monitors. "Of course I came," Marcus replied, surprised by the raw emotion in his own voice. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Lena smiled weakly. "Mama says rich people get tired of helping." The statement was delivered without judgment, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had learned not to expect too much from the world. Marcus took her small hand in both of his, feeling how fragile her fingers were, how easily broken. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, and meant it with a certainty that surprised him. "We're going to get you better." In the depth of that struggle, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of hospital halls and the quiet desperation of parents fighting for their children's lives, Marcus experienced a transformation that no amount of wealth had been able to purchase. He poured his resources into Lena's care, hiring specialists, securing private rooms, ensuring she received treatment that Rosa could never have afforded alone. But more importantly, he discovered something he'd lost in the maze of stock options and dividend payments, the simple power of being present. He read to Lena when medicine made her sleepy. He brought Rosa coffee during her vigil, learning about her journey from El Salvador, her dreams for her daughter, the strength that had carried her through poverty that would have broken weaker spirits. One snowy evening, a rarity in San Francisco that felt like a blessing, as Marcus sat beside Lena's hospital bed, her trembling hand slid a folded paper into his palm. It was a drawing, created with the careful intensity that only children bring to important things. The image showed his mansion, but transformed. Windows blazing with warm light, gardens blooming with impossible colors, children playing on lawns where silence used to reign. Above it all, a sun shone with rays that looked like embracing arms. "This is how I see your house," Lena whispered, her voice still weak but gaining strength. "Not empty anymore, full of life, full of people who need somewhere to belong." Marcus stared at the drawing until his vision blurred. In that simple image, drawn with crayons on hospital paper, he saw not just his house, but his future, a purpose that wealth alone had never been able to provide. The drawing became his roadmap, his mission statement, his declaration of independence from the empty success that had nearly destroyed him. That same week, a miracle of a different sort unfolded. Chen Industries, Marcus's biggest competitor reached out through intermediaries with an unexpected offer. Instead of seeking to destroy Marcus's wounded company, CEO Jennifer Wong proposed a merger that would benefit both organizations. The tech industry was consolidating, and companies that had once been rivals were learning the value of cooperation over conquest. "Your AI algorithms complement our hardware innovations," Wong explained during a video conference from her Silicon Valley headquarters. "Together, we could create something neither of us could build alone." But she was clear about her conditions. The merger would only proceed if Marcus returned to active leadership, if he could prove that his company was still guided by vision rather than chaos. Marcus found himself negotiating not with the cutthroat aggression that had once defined his business approach, but with a clarity born of purpose he'd discovered through Lena's eyes. He structured the deal not just to maximize profit, but to ensure that the combined company would invest in educational technology for underserved communities, would create scholarship programs for children like Lena, whose potential was limited only by access to resources. The merger discussions stretched through winter and into spring, complicated by lawyers, board members, and regulatory requirements. But Marcus approached each obstacle with patience that would have been impossible before his transformation. When David Chen accused him of letting emotions cloud his judgment, Marcus simply smiled and said, "Finally." Meanwhile, Lena's recovery progressed like spring itself, slowly, then all at once. Her fever broke on a Tuesday morning when fog lifted early and sunlight flooded her hospital room. Her appetite returned with a vengeance, delighting nurses who had watched her struggle through weeks of barely eating. But more than physical healing, Marcus witnessed the return of her remarkable spirit, the wisdom that seemed too large for her small body, the compassion that saw hope where others saw only obstacles. By late spring, as the merger was finalized and Marcus's company was not just saved but stronger than ever, Lena was ready to go home. Her discharge from the hospital coincided with the first time Marcus's antique clocks had all ticked in harmony since Sarah's death. The sound filled his mansion like a heartbeat, like a promise that time moved forward and healing was possible. But Marcus's transformation demanded more than personal healing. It required action that matched the scope of his revelation. Throughout the summer, he worked with architects and planners to convert portions of his Pacific Heights mansion into community spaces. The grand ballroom, where he and Sarah had once hosted charity galas, became a computer lab where neighborhood children could learn coding and digital design. The library, lined with first editions he'd never read, became a quiet study space where students could escape cramped apartments and focus on homework. His estate's grounds, once manicured for show, were redesigned as community gardens where families could grow vegetables and flowers, where children could learn that beauty and sustenance could spring from soil and patience. The lake where he'd found Lena became the centerpiece of a program that taught water safety while honoring the transformative power of that first desperate splash that had called him back to life. Lena, no longer just a visitor but an integral part of Marcus's extended family, helped design these programs with insights that adults had overlooked. She understood which activities would appeal to children who had learned not to trust easy promises, which approaches would reach parents worn down by struggle and skepticism. Her mother, Rosa, initially suspicious of Marcus's motives, gradually became a trusted advisor and eventually the community outreach coordinator for what became known as the Hendley Foundation. The mansion's silence gave way to sounds Marcus had forgotten he missed. Children's laughter echoing through halls that had known only whispered conversations, teenagers debating in study groups, families sharing meals in spaces that had been designed for loneliness. Rosa's cooking filled the kitchen with scents that reminded Marcus of community, of belonging, of the difference between a house full of expensive things and a home full of life. Through it all, Lena remained his anchor to the person he was becoming. Her friendship kept him grounded when success threatened to intoxicate him again, reminded him that wealth was only valuable when it served something greater than itself. They still met by the lake some evenings, watching fog roll in from the bay. But now their conversations were interwoven with the sound of other voices. Children playing, parents chatting, the community that had grown around the seed of their unlikely friendship. Marcus realized that power without purpose was indeed nothing. But love, even from the smallest among us, could be empire-building in ways he'd never imagined. His company's stock price not only recovered, but reached record highs as investors recognized that his renewed leadership had given the organization something more valuable than aggressive expansion: a soul. Years passed like pages in a book that rewrote itself with each turning. The mansion transformed beyond recognition. Walls that had once displayed artwork no one saw now showcased children's drawings, certificates of achievement, photographs of families celebrating milestones that might not have been possible without access to resources and support. The spaces once devoted to impressing visitors who never came now hummed with the energy of people building better lives for themselves and their children. Marcus, now in his mid-50s with silver threading through his hair, found himself living a life he couldn't have imagined during his years of solitary success. His daily routine included not just board meetings and financial reviews, but also tutoring sessions with high school students, conversations with parents about their children's dreams, community dinners where stories were shared in multiple languages, but understood by hearts that spoke the universal language of hope. Lena, now 12, and growing into the remarkable young woman everyone who knew her had predicted she would become, remained a central figure in Marcus's life, not as the child he had saved, but as the teacher who had saved him. Her insights continued to amaze him, her compassion continued to humble him, and her friendship continued to remind him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars or stock options. On quiet evenings when the community center had closed and the mansion returned to something approaching peaceful silence, Marcus would sit in his study, now shared space where children did homework and adults attended financial literacy classes, and marvel at the journey that had brought him to this place. The antique clocks ticked in harmony, marking time that no longer felt like an enemy, but like a friend carrying him toward purposes he was still discovering. The photograph of Sarah had returned to its place on the mantel, but it was no longer an artifact of grief. Instead, it was surrounded by new memories, pictures of community celebrations, graduation ceremonies, families who had found stability and hope through programs that honored her memory by helping create the kind of world she had always believed was possible. Marcus had learned the hardest lessons, that wealth could vanish overnight like morning fog, but grace could renew a broken heart with the persistence of spring returning to barren ground. That success without meaning was just elaborate emptiness, but service rooted in love could create wealth that no market crash could destroy. That sometimes salvation came not from boardrooms or bank accounts, but from small hands reaching out in trust, from innocent hearts that still believed in miracles. The little girl he had pulled from the lake had become the wellspring of his renewal, proof that his empire had been saved not by shareholders or strategic mergers, but by innocence and faith, by the recognition that every life he touched was an opportunity to honor the gift Lena had given him, the chance to remember what it meant to be human. But stories like these don't end with neat conclusions. They spiral outward like ripples from a stone cast into still water, touching shores we never intended to reach, transforming landscapes we never thought to explore. 5 years after that first desperate splash in Marcus's lake, the Hendley Foundation had grown beyond anything its founder could have envisioned. What had begun as a grieving man's attempt to repay one child's kindness had become a network of support that stretched across San Francisco's most forgotten neighborhoods. The foundation's newest initiative was perhaps its most ambitious, a program that paired successful executives with inner-city families, not as charity cases to be managed, but as teachers with wisdom gleaned from different struggles. Marcus had learned that Rosa's insights into budgeting with impossible limitations were often more valuable than his Harvard MBA. The teenage mothers in the projects understood time management in ways that would impress any Fortune 500 CEO. The children who had learned to be vigilant on dangerous streets possessed awareness and resilience that no corporate training could instill. Each pairing was carefully orchestrated, with Lena often serving as the bridge between worlds that spoke different languages of success. At 14, she possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that consistently amazed the psychologists and social workers who studied the program's unprecedented success rates. Her ability to see past surface fears and connect hearts across divides had become legendary among Foundation staff. But success brought new challenges. Media attention that Marcus desperately wanted to avoid began focusing on the billionaire and the barrio girl angle that sensationalized their story while missing its deeper truths. Documentary filmmakers called wanting to capture the feel-good transformation without understanding that real change was messier, more complex, less suitable for 90-minute narratives that preferred clear villains and heroes. The attention made Rosa deeply uncomfortable. She had never wanted to be anyone's inspiration story, never sought to represent anything other than a mother doing whatever it took to provide for her daughter. The scrutiny felt intrusive, dangerous even, in a neighborhood where being too visible could attract the wrong kind of attention. She worried that fame might corrupt Lena, might make her forget where she came from, or, worse, be ashamed of it. Marcus found himself navigating these concerns with increasing sophistication. The Foundation hired professional publicists whose job was not to seek attention, but to manage it, to ensure that any coverage focused on systemic issues rather than individual personalities. He learned to use his influence to redirect spotlights away from the families the Foundation served and toward the policy changes that might address root causes of inequality. Meanwhile, Lena continued to surprise everyone who thought they understood her. Instead of being seduced by the privileges her connection to Marcus could provide, she became more deeply rooted in her community. She insisted on staying in public school, though Marcus could have provided access to the most exclusive private institutions. She chose to deepen her Spanish rather than abandon it, spending summers in El Salvador with Rosa's extended family, learning about the struggles that had driven her grandparents to seek better lives across dangerous borders. "I don't want to escape from where I come from," she explained to Marcus during one of their evening walks around the lake. "I want to build bridges back to it." Her words carried in wisdom that humbled him, a clarity about identity and purpose that he envied. At 14, she understood something it had taken him 50 years to discover, that running from your past was like trying to outrun your shadow, while embracing it could transform weakness into strength. The Foundation's work expanded to include scholarship programs that didn't just pay for college but provided mentorship throughout students' academic journeys. Too many bright kids from struggling families fell through cracks, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked cultural capital, understanding of how to navigate systems designed for families with different resources and expectations. The Foundation's mentors helped students decode unspoken rules, provided support networks when homesickness and imposter syndrome threatened to overwhelm them, celebrated achievements with people who understood their magnitude. Marcus watched with pride as the first cohort of Foundation scholars graduated from colleges and universities across the country. Many returned to San Francisco, bringing their degrees back to communities that had invested hope in their success. They became teachers, social workers, entrepreneurs, doctors, professionals whose understanding of struggle informed their service in ways the textbooks couldn't teach. The cyclical nature of their giving back created sustainability that traditional charity models had never achieved. But perhaps the most profound changes occurred within Marcus himself. The anger and cynicism that had calcified around his heart like scar tissue slowly dissolved under the consistent warmth of community connection. He found himself laughing more easily, crying without shame, experiencing emotions with an intensity he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. The foundation's work had given him purpose beyond profit, but the relationships it fostered had given him something even more precious: joy. Rosa had become not just a colleague but a trusted friend whose perspective he valued above that of any business advisor. Her ability to see through pretension and speak truth with gentle directness had made her indispensable not just to the foundation, but to Marcus personally. When board members proposed expansion plans that sounded impressive but lacked practical grounding, Rosa would ask simple questions that revealed fundamental flaws no consultant had identified. How does this help Maria's baby get better childcare so she can finish nursing school? Rosa might inquire about some elaborate new program. Or, what good is a computer lab if kids don't have quiet places to study at home? Her questions always returned focus to real people facing real challenges, preventing the foundation from drifting into the kind of abstract philanthropy that served donors' egos better than recipients' needs. The relationship between Marcus and Lena had evolved as she matured, but it remained central to both their lives. She no longer seemed like a child dispensing mystical wisdom. Instead, she had become a thoughtful teenager, grappling with normal adolescent struggles while maintaining the extraordinary empathy that had first captured Marcus's attention. He watched her navigate high school social dynamics with grace, balancing friendships with classmates from vastly different backgrounds while staying true to values that couldn't be compromised. When Lena faced her first real heartbreak at 15, a boy who lost interest when he learned she lived in public housing, Marcus found himself in the unfamiliar role of surrogate uncle, offering comfort and perspective to someone he loved like family. The conversation took place by their lake as autumn painted the surrounding trees in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Marcus of hope persisting through seasons of change. "He wasn't worthy of you," Marcus said simply, surprised by the protective anger he felt toward someone who had hurt this remarkable young woman who meant so much to him. "It's not about being worthy," Lena replied, her voice carrying only slight traces of the pain she was processing. "It's about people not knowing how to see past surface things to what really matters. He's not a bad person. He just hasn't learned to look deeper yet." Even in heartbreak, she found compassion for someone who had wounded her. The maturity she displayed continually amazed Marcus, reminding him that wisdom wasn't correlated with age in the ways most people assumed. That autumn brought unexpected challenges when economic recession threatened to reduce the foundation's funding just as demand for its services increased. Wealthy donors who had been generous during prosperity became cautious as their own portfolios declined. Corporate sponsors reduced philanthropic budgets to protect quarters earnings. The foundation faced the possibility of cutting programs precisely when struggling families needed them most. Marcus found himself drawing on reserves, both financial and emotional, that he hadn't known he possessed. He liquidated investments, sold properties, restructured his own lifestyle to ensure the foundation could continue serving families who depended on its support. But money alone couldn't solve everything. The challenging economic climate required creative solutions, sustainable models that didn't rely solely on the generosity of the wealthy. Lena surprised everyone by proposing that the foundation launch social enterprises, businesses that generated revenue while advancing social missions. Her idea was to create a catering company staffed by program participants, providing job training and employment while generating income to support other foundation activities. The plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both business principles and community needs, synthesizing lessons learned from Marcus's entrepreneurial experience with Rosa's practical wisdom about what kinds of opportunities would actually benefit their neighbors. The catering company, launched with Lena as its youngest consultant, became a powerful example of how communities could create their own solutions rather than simply receiving charity from outside sources. Rosa managed operations with efficiency that impressed Marcus's business associates, while participants learned skills ranging from food safety certification to customer service to financial management. The company's success attracted attention from other cities interested in replicating the model, transforming the foundation from local charity to national innovator. Marcus watched with wonder as the enterprise exceeded all projections, not just financially, but in terms of human development. Participants gained confidence along with paychecks, dignity along with skills. Former clients became employees, became managers, creating advancement opportunities that traditional job training programs rarely provided. The business generated pride within the community. This wasn't something being done for them or to them, but something they had built themselves with support and resources that amplified their own capabilities. The success brought Marcus full circle to a realization that had been growing gradually over years of foundation work. The most sustainable solutions to social problems weren't those imposed by well-meaning outsiders, but those that emerged from communities themselves when provided with appropriate resources and respect. His role was not to save anyone, but to create platforms where people could save themselves, could build the kinds of lives and communities they envisioned. This understanding transformed his approach to business as well. The merged company that had emerged from his negotiations with Jennifer Wong had grown into a technology leader, but under Marcus's evolved leadership, it prioritized different kinds of innovation. Instead of focusing solely on products that generated maximum profit, the company invested heavily in educational technology, accessibility features, and tools that empowered rather than replacing human capabilities. The company's most successful product became an AI tutoring system designed specifically for students in under-resourced schools. Unlike expensive educational software that required extensive training and infrastructure, this system worked on basic devices, adapted to different learning styles, and provided the kind of individualized attention that overwhelmed teachers couldn't always offer. The product succeeded commercially precisely because it addressed real needs rather than creating artificial demand. Marcus's leadership style had been transformed by years of learning from Rosa's direct communication, Lena's empathetic insights, and hundreds of foundation families who had taught him that authentic strength came from vulnerability, not invulnerability. He led with questions rather than directives, listened more than he spoke, and created space for perspectives that challenged his assumptions rather than confirming his biases. The company's culture reflected these changes. Employee retention reached industry-leading levels as workers felt genuinely valued rather than simply used. Innovation flourished when people felt safe to propose ideas that might fail, to experiment without fear of punishment, to collaborate across departments and disciplines in ways that hierarchical structures had previously prevented. Revenue growth continued, but it was balanced with metrics measuring employee satisfaction, environmental impact, and social benefit. When Lena turned 16, Marcus offered to pay for any college preparatory program she desired, any private school that might enhance her already impressive academic record. Her response shouldn't have surprised him, but it did. She chose to remain in public school, but asked if the foundation could fund better resources for her classmates who wouldn't have the advantages her connection to Marcus provided. "I don't want to leave people behind," she explained. "I want to bring everyone forward together." The distinction was subtle but profound, reflecting a value system that prioritized collective advancement over individual achievement. Her request led to the Foundation's most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive support program for her entire school that addressed everything from building infrastructure to teacher retention to family engagement. The school partnership became a laboratory for educational innovation, demonstrating how community resources could transform even the most challenged institutions. Student test scores improved, but more importantly, school culture shifted. Parents became more involved, teachers reported greater job satisfaction, and students began to see education as a pathway to possibility rather than a requirement to endure. Marcus found himself spending increasing amounts of time at the school, not as a distant benefactor, but as an engaged community member. He tutored students in computer programming, learned Spanish from teenagers who corrected his pronunciation with patient humor, and discovered that 18-year-olds from the Tenderloin often possessed insights into technology trends that his highly paid consultants had missed. The work continued to evolve, but its center remained constant. The relationship between Marcus and Lena that had begun with a splash in a lake and grown into something that anchored both their lives. As Lena prepared for college applications, she and Marcus spent long evenings discussing her future, her dreams, the impact she wanted to have on the world. "I want to study social work and business," she announced during one of these conversations. "I want to understand both how to help people and how to create sustainable systems that don't depend on anyone's charity or guilt." Marcus smiled, recognizing in her plans the same synthesis of practical and idealistic thinking that had transformed his own life. "You've already been doing both," he observed. "College will just give you more tools." As spring arrived with its annual promise of renewal, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this place. The mansion still overlooked San Francisco Bay, but it had been transformed from a monument to isolation into a center of community life. The antique clocks still ticked in harmony, but now they marked time filled with purpose, relationships, and the kind of joy that comes from serving something greater than oneself. The foundation had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, but its impact couldn't be measured solely in programs served or dollars distributed. It had created ripple effects that spread through families, neighborhoods, and communities in ways that defied quantification. Children who received tutoring became young adults who mentored others. Parents who found stable employment became community leaders. Families who experienced support during crises became advocates for policies that helped other struggling families. Marcus understood now that his true wealth had never been measured in stock prices or real estate values. His real fortune was the network of relationships he had built, the lives he had touched and been touched by, the community that had grown around the foundation's work. These assets couldn't be stolen by market crashes or dissolved by corporate takeovers. They were invested in human hearts and harvested in moments of connection that made life worth living. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had occurred within Marcus himself. The broken man who had sat alone in a mansion, surrounded by luxuries that provided no comfort, had been replaced by someone who woke each morning energized by possibilities, who went to sleep each night grateful for the day's small victories and meaningful defeats. The antique clocks had resumed their ticking, but more importantly, his heart had remembered how to beat in rhythm with other hearts, how to keep time with the community that had adopted him as surely as he had adopted them. And you, wherever you are listening to this story, have you ever met someone small who changed your life in immense ways? Perhaps it was a grandchild who reminded you how to wonder, a student who taught you something you thought you already knew, or a stranger's kindness that arrived precisely when you needed to believe again in goodness. These moments of grace don't announce themselves with fanfare. They come quietly, often wearing ordinary faces, speaking in gentle voices that we almost miss over the noise of our complicated lives. Maybe you're remembering someone right now, a child who looked at you with eyes that saw past your defenses, who offered trust when you thought you'd forgotten how to deserve it. Maybe you're thinking about opportunities to be that person for someone else, to offer the kind of presence that says, "You matter," without needing to use words. The story of Marcus and Lena continues to unfold, not just in the foundation's work or the company's innovations, but in countless small moments of connection that happen whenever people choose to bridge divides rather than widen them, whenever successful individuals remember that their achievements are meaningless without community to share them with, whenever children are allowed to teach adults the wisdom that comes from hearts not yet hardened by disappointment. Their lake still reflects the changing seasons, still provides a place for quiet conversations and simple revelations. The roses in Sarah's garden bloom with renewed vigor, tended by many hands and nourished by the love that flows when people understand that healing happens in community. that strength grows when shared, and that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of courage. Tell me your story in the comments below. Share the moment when someone small opened your heart to something larger than yourself. Let's create a community of people who understand that hope often arrives in packages we don't expect, wearing faces that remind us why we're here. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of something precious you thought you'd lost, leave a like and subscribe so this message can reach other souls who need to remember that miracles still happen, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from the smallest teachers. Because in the end, we all need reminding that wealth without wisdom is poverty, that success without service is failure, and that the richest lives are those invested in others' dreams. Sometimes it takes a child's voice to call us back from the edges of despair, to remind us that love is the only currency that multiplies when spent, that community is the only investment that pays dividends in joy, and that every splash in every lake might be someone's cry for help, or their invitation to dive deeper into the waters of compassion that connect us all.